In the high Arctic, there is a silent sound that keeps engineers awake at night. It isn't the wind, and it isn't the machinery of the mines. It is the sound of concrete snapping. For 70 years, the Soviet Union performed a miracle of engineering. They built hero cities where no human was meant to live. They planted forests of steel and stone into ground as hard as granite. They called it Permafrost, a permanent frozen foundation for a permanent empire. But in 2026, the word permanent has become a trillion-ruble lie. Across 65% of Russia's landmass, the very earth is liquefying. This isn't just a story about a changing climate, it is an intelligence briefing on an industrial catastrophe. While the rest of the world watches sea levels rise, Russia is watching its most vital economic organs sink into the mud. Why is Russia's crisis more alarming than the rest of the world? Because while Alaska has villages and Canada has outposts, Russia has cities. It has thousands of miles of high-pressure gas pipelines and the world's most expensive industrial infrastructure sitting on a foundation that is physically disappearing. Today, we go inside the forensics of a sinking empire. We look at the $100 billion tax that nature is levying on the Kremlin and the secret structural failures that threaten to bankrupt Russia's future. To understand the disaster of today, we have to look at the arrogance of yesterday. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union didn't just want to extract resources, they wanted to conquer the north. They built cities like Norilsk, Yakutsk, and Vorkuta. These weren't temporary camps, they were grand architectural statements, massive Stalinist blocks designed to house hundreds of thousands of workers. Soviet engineers knew the ground was frozen. Their solution was ingenious. They drove massive concrete piles 30 meters deep into the permafrost. They calculated that the ice would act like a natural glue, holding the piles in a frozen grip forever. They built the buildings on stilts to allow cold air to circulate underneath, preventing the building's own heat from melting the ground. This wasn't just for show. This region is the beating heart of the Russian economy. Norilsk provides 20% of the world's nickel and 40% of its palladium. The Yamal Peninsula holds the world's largest natural gas reserves. The Soviet Union bet the entire bank on the idea that the Arctic would remain a frozen fortress. They ignored the warnings of geologists. They built an empire on the assumption that the Earth would never change its mind. Now, that bet is failing. What's happening in 2026 isn't a slow tilt, it's a structural collapse. As temperatures in the Arctic rise 4 times faster than the global average, the active layer of the soil is reaching deeper. The glue is turning into water. In Yakutsk, the world's largest city built on permafrost, the statistics are terrifying. Recent surveys show that over 300 large buildings have suffered critical deformations. In Norilsk, the numbers are worse. Nearly 60% of the housing stock has been damaged by the shifting earth. Imagine living in a 10-story concrete building when the left side of the foundation drops 6 inches, but the right side stays firm. The building doesn't just lean, it tears itself apart. But the skyscrapers are only half the problem. The real ghost city risk lies in the pipelines. Russia operates over 75,000 kilometers of oil and gas pipelines in the permafrost zone. When the ground thaws, it doesn't just sink evenly. It creates thermokarst, sudden pits and sinkholes. Pipelines designed to be perfectly level are now being bent and twisted by the earth. In the last decade, the number of accidents and leaks in the Russian north has skyrocketed, but most are kept out of the international press. These are the silent heart attacks of the Russian energy industry. If you want to see the future of Russia's empire, look at the summer of 2020. In the industrial city of Norilsk, a massive fuel storage tank suddenly ruptured, dumping 21,000 tons of diesel into the Ambonaya River. The water turned a toxic crimson, visible from space. The official investigation confirmed the nightmare. The permafrost underneath the tank's support pillars had melted. The pillars sank, the tank buckled, and the economy bled. The parent company, Norilsk, was forced to pay a record $2 billion fine, but that was just the cleanup cost. It didn't account for the lost trust or the permanent damage to the ecosystem. This is money that Russia cannot afford to spend. Even Russia's great hope, the Northern Sea Route, is at risk. To bypass the Suez Canal, Russia is building massive new ports like Sabetta. But a port requires stable ground for cranes, storage tanks, and railways. As the permafrost retreats, these multi-billion-dollar ports are becoming unstable. The gateway to the east is being built on a swamp. The very ice that Russia is waiting to melt to open the sea lanes is the same ice that is destroying the ports needed to service them. Russia's ghost cities of the north aren't empty because of a lack of money. They are becoming empty because the Earth has revoked its permission for them to exist. The Soviet Union spent a century trying to prove that ideology was stronger than geography. They built a sinking empire on the belief that the cold was eternal. But as the ground turns to water, the world is learning a hard lesson. You can ignore the laws of economics for a while. You can ignore the laws of politics for a generation. But you cannot ignore the ground beneath your feet. The data doesn't lie. Morgan Stanley research confirms that the loss of bearing capacity in the frozen north is no longer just a climate issue. It's a systemic financial risk that puts nearly half of Russia's oil and gas fields in the danger zone. Even Norilsk, the world's largest palladium producer, has been forced to launch a first-of-its-kind geotechnical monitoring system to track its foundations 24/7. When a company that survived the Soviet collapse starts spending billions on soil sensors, you know the ground is no longer solid. We track the hidden systems that run and occasionally ruin our world. Smash the like button to help us fight the algorithm and subscribe to Capitoria. Because while the ground beneath Russia might be shaky, your understanding of global power shouldn't be. I'll see you in the next one, unless of course the internet cables are also built on permafrost.